The letter sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I found the courage to open it, and when I finally did, my hands were shaking so badly that the paper tore along the fold. 46 years old, and I was afraid of an envelope. Not because of what was written inside, I already knew, more or less, what it would say, but because opening it meant admitting that everything I had built my life around was about to collapse into dust. I had been baptized at 19, in a rented hall that smelled of chlorine and cheap carpet, surrounded by people who told me I was making the most important decision of my life. For 27 years, I knocked on doors before sunrise on Saturday mornings. I sat through judicial committees as a witness, watched families torn apart over cigarettes and college degrees, and told my own daughter that if she left the congregation, I would have to stop speaking to her. I believed, with everything I had, that I was standing on the one true path while the rest of the world stumbled in darkness. Then my son got sick. It was nothing dramatic at first, just fatigue, some bruising, blood tests that came back wrong. But within 2 weeks, the doctors were using words like leukemia, and transfusion, and time-sensitive, and I found myself standing in a hospital corridor being handed a form by 2 elders I had known for 15 years, reminding me, gently but firmly, of what our faith required of me as a mother. I signed that form. And 3 days later, in a moment I will spend the rest of my life trying to forgive myself for, I began to ask the question that would end everything I thought I knew: what if we were wrong? My name doesn't matter as much as what happened to me, but I'll tell you anyway. I'm Marisol, and until 18 months ago, I was a devoted, dyed-in-the-wool Jehovah's Witness living a quiet, disciplined life in a small congregation in Ohio, surrounded by people I loved and trusted more than almost anyone else on earth. I was a pioneer for over a decade. I raised 2 children inside the organization. I believed, without a shred of doubt, that Armageddon was close, that the governing body in Brooklyn spoke with something close to divine authority, and that everyone outside our community, including my own sister, who left when she was 22, was walking toward destruction. What I'm about to share with you isn't a story I tell for sympathy, and it isn't an attack dressed up as a memoir. It's simply what happened to me, told as honestly as I know how, from the moment my son's diagnosis cracked open a door I had spent my whole adult life keeping shut, to the year that followed, when I learned things about the organization I had given my entire identity to that I still struggle to say out loud. If you're new here, this channel exists for stories exactly like this one, real accounts of faith, doubt, family, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding a life from the ground up. If any part of what I share resonates with you, whether because you've lived something similar or because you simply believe stories like mine deserve to be heard, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit subscribe and leave a like before you go. It genuinely helps this story reach the people who need to hear it. And I'd love to know, in the comments, tell me what city or country you're watching from tonight. I've heard from viewers in every corner of the world, some of whom grew up in the same kind of congregation I did, thousands of miles away but living almost identical lives. There's something strange and comforting about realizing how many of us share this particular kind of story, no matter where we're from. So settle in. This isn't a short one. It's the story of how a woman who spent nearly 3 decades certain of her place in the universe woke up one year to find that certainty gone, and had to learn, at 46, how to build a life on the other side of it. The night before my son Tobias was admitted to the hospital, I remember standing at my kitchen sink washing dishes I didn't need to wash, just to have something to do with my hands. He was 17, tall and gangly in that way boys are at that age, and he had come home from basketball practice complaining that he was more tired than usual. I told him to drink some orange juice and go to bed. I had no idea that within 48 hours, our entire world would be rearranged around a diagnosis none of us saw coming. Acute myeloid leukemia. The oncologist said the words slowly, the way doctors do when they know the news will need repeating. I remember gripping the arm of the chair so hard my knuckles went white, and I remember my husband, Julius, going very still beside me, the particular stillness of a man trying not to fall apart in front of strangers. We asked all the questions parents ask. Survival rates. Treatment protocols. How fast? How bad? And somewhere in that conversation, the doctor mentioned, almost in passing, that Tobias would likely need blood transfusions as part of his treatment. I felt the floor tilt. Within our congregation, the prohibition on blood transfusions wasn't a suggestion, it was doctrine, drawn from a particular reading of scripture about abstaining from blood, and it was treated with the same weight as any other command we believed came from God Himself. I had known families who refused transfusions for their children. I had sat in meetings where we were reminded that faithfulness sometimes required sacrifice, that Jehovah would remember those who remained loyal even unto death. I had nodded along to all of it, never once imagining I would be the mother standing in that hospital hallway, holding a hospital liaison committee card in my purse, watching 2 elders from our congregation walk toward me with expressions of practiced compassion. Elder Bartholomew, a kind man, genuinely, someone who had brought us casseroles when Julius lost his job years earlier, sat with us in a small consultation room and talked us through what he called our rights as witnesses to refuse blood products, and the alternative treatments the hospital could offer instead. He spoke of the Watchtower Society's medical liaison program, the network of hospitals more willing to work with our restrictions, the legal documents we could sign to make our wishes binding even if Tobias, as a minor, couldn't consent for himself in the eyes of the law. He was doing exactly what he had been trained to do. And I sat there, a mother whose son might die, nodding along because nodding along was the only thing I had ever known how to do. I signed the advance directive that night. I told myself I was being faithful. I told myself Jehovah would honor our obedience, that this was a test not unlike the ones described in the scriptures I had studied my whole life, that somewhere in the blood work and the treatment plans there would be a path that didn't require what I was most afraid of. For nearly a week, that belief held. Then Tobias's numbers crashed. The oncologist called us into a private room, and this time there was no gentleness in her voice, only urgency. Without transfusion, she said, plainly, Tobias would likely die within days. The alternative treatments Elder Bartholomew had described were not sufficient for the severity of his condition. This was not a matter of preference anymore. This was a matter of a 17-year-old boy's life measured in hours. I remember looking at Julius. I remember the silence between us stretching so long it felt like its own kind of answer. And I remember, for the first time in 27 years, allowing myself to think a thought I had never let surface before: what if the men who wrote these rules had never once stood where I was standing? I won't pretend the decision came easily, or that it came from some sudden collapse of faith. It came from something much slower and more agonizing, a kind of internal civil war that lasted exactly 11 hours, from the moment the oncologist gave us her ultimatum to the moment I finally signed the consent for transfusion, sitting alone in the hospital chapel at 4 a.m. because I couldn't bear to have anyone watch me do it. Julius, to his credit, had come to the same conclusion faster than I had. He said, quietly, that no God worth worshipping would want a father to bury his son over a rule written by men in an office in New York who had never met Tobias, never sat beside his hospital bed, never watched him try to smile through the fear in his eyes. I remember being almost angry at how easily the words came to him, as if he hadn't spent as many years as I had believing those men spoke with divine authority. But Julius had always held his faith a little more loosely than I did. I was the one who pioneered. I was the one who gave the talks at the Kingdom Hall. I was the one whose entire sense of self had been built, brick by brick, on the certainty that we were right and everyone else was wrong. Signing that consent form felt like tearing something out of my own chest. I kept thinking about the judicial committees I had sat on as a witness over the years, the disfellowshipping of a young man for smoking, the disassociation of a woman who had gone to a wedding at a Catholic church, the quiet, devastating shunning that followed both of them, cutting them off not just from the congregation but from their own families, some of whom I knew personally refused to speak to their own children ever again. I thought about how easily we had applied that same rigid, unbending logic to matters of the heart, and I understood, with a kind of sick clarity, that the same logic would be applied to me now. If I authorized this transfusion, and someone in the congregation found out, I would not simply be forgiven. I would be judged. Tobias received his first transfusion at 5:40 that morning. I sat beside his bed and watched the bag empty slowly into the line in his arm, and I prayed, genuinely prayed, the way I had been taught my whole life, not for forgiveness for what I had done, but for the strength to live with whatever came next. I didn't yet know how much would come next. I didn't know that within 3 weeks, someone from our congregation would see Tobias's hospital records, that word would travel the way it always does in a tight-knit community, and that I would be summoned to a private meeting with the body of elders to explain myself. What I remember most from that meeting isn't the questions they asked, though there were many. It's the moment one of the elders, a man I had known since before I married Julius, a man who had stood at my baptism, looked at me and said that my spiritual weakness in that hospital could serve as a testing point for the congregation's judicial committee. That phrase stayed with me for months afterward. Testing point. As if my son's life had been a hypothetical scenario in a classroom, rather than a 17-year-old boy fighting for every breath in a hospital bed 3 miles away. I left that meeting and drove to the parking lot of a grocery store, where I sat in my car for almost 2 hours, unable to make myself drive home. Somewhere in that stretch of silence, I opened my phone and, for the first time in my adult life, typed a search into Google that I had spent 27 years being warned never to type: Jehovah's Witnesses blood transfusion controversy. I didn't know it yet, but I had just opened the door I would spend the rest of the year walking through. What I found on the other side of that search bar didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, over weeks, in the stolen hours after everyone else in my house had gone to sleep, my phone brightness turned down low so Julius wouldn't wake and ask what I was doing. I read academic articles about the history of the blood doctrine, how the interpretation had shifted multiple times over the decades, how organ transplants, once forbidden, had quietly become permissible, how certain blood fractions, once banned, were later declared acceptable through what the organization called New Light. I sat in my car outside the library, reading through documents I had never been permitted to see inside our own congregation, understanding for the first time that the doctrine I had nearly let my son die for had not been handed down from an unchanging God, but revised, again and again, by a small group of men whose interpretations shifted with the decades. That alone might not have been enough to break something so deeply rooted in me. I had absorbed, over nearly 3 decades, an entire framework for explaining away contradictions. New Light wasn't a euphemism for error, we were taught, but evidence of God refining his people gradually, the way a father teaches a child. I could have folded this discovery into that framework too, if it had stood alone. It didn't stand alone. I found court documents, public, verifiable, filed in jurisdictions across several countries, describing the organization's internal policy requiring 2 witnesses to an act of child abuse before elders would report it to their own judicial process, a policy that had, in case after case, protected abusers rather than the children in their care. I read about the Australian Royal Commission's findings, about congregations where known abusers had been quietly moved between assignments rather than reported to civil authorities, about survivors who described being told, as children, that speaking out against a baptized brother was itself a sin requiring repentance. I thought of my own daughter, Camila, who had left the congregation at 20 and had barely spoken to me in 6 years, not because she had rebelled against God, as I had always told myself, but because, and this thought arrived in my chest like something breaking, she had tried, once, years earlier, to tell me something uncomfortable about a family friend, and I had told her to pray about forgiveness instead of listening. I sat with that memory for a long time. I began reading testimonies from former witnesses, not bitter, angry rants, as I had always been taught to expect from apostates, but calm, devastating accounts of families destroyed by disfellowshipping, of elderly parents who died alone because their children had been taught that speaking to a shunned relative risked their own standing before God. Of young people who had been discouraged from pursuing higher education or medical careers because the end was believed to be too near to bother, only to find themselves, decades later, with no education and no path forward when the end never came. I recognized every single pattern. I had lived inside every single one of them. I had enforced some of them myself, on other families, believing with my whole heart that I was doing the loving thing. The night I finished reading the 2019 report on child sexual abuse allegations within the organization, documenting names, dates, and settlements across multiple countries, I did not sleep at all. I lay next to Julius in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling something enormous and irreversible shift loose inside my chest, like a foundation stone finally giving way after decades of quiet erosion. By morning, I understood that I could never again stand at that door with a magazine in my hand and tell a stranger I had found the truth. I want to be honest about something. I did not leave quietly, and I did not leave immediately. For nearly 4 months after that sleepless night, I kept attending meetings. I kept going out in service, though my heart was no longer in it, going through motions I had performed so many times they required no thought at all. I told myself I needed time. I told myself I might be wrong, that the sources I had read might be exaggerated or distorted, that surely an organization I had trusted my entire adult life could not truly be capable of the things I had found described in cold legal language across dozens of documents from dozens of countries. But small things kept accumulating, the way sediment settles at the bottom of still water. I noticed, for the first time really noticing, how frightened the younger sisters in our congregation seemed whenever a judicial committee was mentioned, how carefully everyone policed their own words in case something might later be used against them. I noticed how quickly the congregation had closed ranks around the elder whose son had been quietly moved to a different congregation the previous year, under circumstances nobody was permitted to ask about. I noticed, with a clarity that frightened me, how much of my daily life had been organized around fear of Armageddon, fear of disfellowshipping, fear of a God who seemed to require constant proof of loyalty through obedience to men I had never met. The end, when it came, arrived in an ordinary way. I made the mistake, though I no longer think of it as a mistake, of asking a question during a smaller group meeting, a question about why the organization's predicted dates for the end of the world had been revised so many times throughout its history, and why members who raised similar questions were so often labeled as having a weak or rebellious spirit rather than simply a curious one. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but I felt every eye in that room turn toward me with something between pity and suspicion. Within a week, I received a call asking me to meet with the elders. I already knew what that meeting would be. I sat across from 3 men I had known for most of my adult life, men who had stood in my kitchen for meals, who had prayed over my children when they were sick, who I had genuinely loved as spiritual family, and I listened as they explained, gently but unmistakably, that my recent comments suggested a dangerous drift away from the organization's teachings, that continuing down this path could result in formal discipline, and that they hoped, sincerely, that I would return to a place of full faith before matters became more serious. I remember looking at each of their faces and realizing, with a strange calm I hadn't expected, that I was no longer afraid of what they might decide to do to me. I told them, as steadily as I could manage, that I could not in good conscience pretend certainty I no longer felt, and that I needed time away from the congregation to think. I did not use the word leaving. I didn't need to. I watched it register in their faces anyway, the particular kind of disappointment reserved for someone the organization has already begun mentally filing away as lost. I walked out of that building that evening and did not go back inside it again. Nobody prepares you for what happens after. I had spent my whole life believing that if I ever left, it would be because I had grown cold toward God, weak, worldly, ensnared by Satan's system of things, as I had been taught to describe anyone who walked away. I did not expect that leaving would feel less like losing my faith and more like losing every single person I had ever loved, all at once, in a slow and deliberate silence that no one would ever officially explain to me. Within 3 weeks, my phone had gone almost entirely quiet. Women I had spoken to nearly every day for over a decade, women whose children I had babysat, whose family emergencies I had shown up for at 2 in the morning, whose secrets I had kept for years, simply stopped responding to my messages. I understood, intellectually, that this was not personal cruelty but doctrinal obligation. They had been taught, as I had once taught others, that continued association with someone drifting from the truth risked contaminating their own spiritual standing. But understanding it did not make it hurt any less. The hardest silence came from my own mother, 81 years old, still an active member of a congregation 2 states away. When I called to explain, carefully, without accusation, what I had learned and why I could no longer continue attending meetings, she was quiet for a long moment before telling me, in a voice I had never heard her use before, that she hoped I would come to my senses before it was too late, and that until I did, she felt she had no choice but to limit our contact, for the sake of her own conscience before Jehovah. I have spoken to her 4 times in the 18 months since. Each conversation has been shorter and more careful than the last. Tobias, thankfully, recovered, slowly, painfully, but fully, and something in his recovery gave me a strange kind of clarity I clung to during the worst weeks of isolation that followed. Watching him regain his strength, watching him laugh again at his sister's jokes over video calls, watching him plan, for the first time in his life, to apply to a university he had once been discouraged from even considering, these small, ordinary miracles became the scaffolding I built a new identity around, one truth at a time. Camila, my daughter, was the one who found me first in the wreckage. She called one evening, hesitant, almost disbelieving, after hearing through a cousin that I had stopped attending meetings. When I told her everything, the transfusion, the documents, the meeting with the elders, the silence that followed, she cried on the phone for nearly 20 minutes, not from sadness but from something that sounded almost like relief, as though she had been waiting 6 years for this exact conversation. She told me, gently, that she had left the congregation partly because of something I had once dismissed too quickly, and I finally, fully, understood what she meant. I apologized to her that night in a way I had never apologized to anyone in my life, without qualification, without defense, without asking God to soften the blow of my own failure. We talk almost every day now. Rebuilding a life at 46, after nearly 3 decades inside a closed and highly structured religious system, is a strange and disorienting process that nobody adequately describes to you beforehand. There is no manual for learning how to make small decisions again, what to believe about death, about morality, about the shape of a meaningful life, after spending your entire adult existence deferring those decisions to an organization that claimed to have already answered them for you. For months, I found myself reaching instinctively for certainty that simply no longer existed, the way an amputee reaches for a limb that isn't there. I started, slowly, to rebuild relationships outside the world I had known. I reconnected with my sister, the one who had left the congregation when she was 22, the one I had been taught to treat with polite, careful distance for over 20 years. She did not gloat, did not say, "I told you so," though she certainly could have. She simply opened her door and let me back into her life as though no time had passed at all, and in doing so, taught me something about grace that I had never quite learned inside the walls of the Kingdom Hall. I began seeing a therapist who specialized in helping people leave high-control religious groups, a woman who explained to me, with more patience than I probably deserved, that many of the fears I still carried, the persistent, low-grade dread that I might be making a catastrophic spiritual mistake, The reflexive guilt that surfaced whenever I made an ordinary decision without first asking whether it aligned with doctrine I no longer believed in, were not signs of weakness, but predictable responses to years spent inside a system engineered around fear of consequence. Learning that these responses had a name, that other people who had left similar organizations described the exact same disorientation, was one of the most healing discoveries of that entire year. Julius and I are still married, still building a life together, though our relationship has changed in ways neither of us expected. We talk now, openly, about things we spent years avoiding, about the years we spent afraid to ask questions, about the small compromises we both made to keep peace within a system that demanded conformity above almost everything else. Tobias started university this past fall, studying biology, driven, he tells me, partly by a desire to understand the disease that nearly took his life and partly by a hunger for knowledge he had spent his adolescence being told wasn't particularly important in a world believed to be ending soon. I still think, often, about the woman I was 18 months ago, standing in that hospital corridor with a pen in her shaking hand, believing with absolute certainty that she was doing the right and faithful thing. I don't hate her. I understand her completely, the fear that shaped her, the love that misdirected her, the decades of teaching that had convinced her that obedience and faithfulness were the same thing. I simply no longer live inside her certainty. I've traded it for something messier, harder to hold on to, but infinitely more honest, the freedom to keep asking questions, for the rest of my life, without fear of what the answers might cost me. It has been 18 months since I walked out of that meeting with the elders, and I won't pretend the wound has fully closed, because some wounds simply become part of the shape of you, carried quietly beneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary life. I still catch myself, sometimes, reaching for language I no longer believe in, a phrase of comfort borrowed from a worldview I've since rejected, and I've learned to let those moments pass without judgment, understanding that unlearning nearly 3 decades of absolute certainty doesn't happen in a straight line, no matter how much I wish it did. What I've gained, in place of that certainty, is something I didn't fully appreciate until I had it, a family rebuilt on honesty rather than obligation, a daughter who calls simply because she wants to, a son who survived not because I finally chose correctly under unbearable pressure, but because modern medicine gave him a chance the doctrine I once clung to had never been designed to offer him. If any part of this resonated with you, whether you've lived something similar, or you simply believe stories like this deserve a wider audience, please consider subscribing, leaving this video a like, and telling me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one, and I'm continually amazed at how far and wide these stories seem to travel. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and never be afraid to keep asking the questions that matter most. I've gained the strange, hard-won privilege of doubt, the freedom to sit with a question and let it remain unanswered, rather than reaching immediately for whatever certainty was handed to me by someone else. If you've made it this far, thank you for sitting with my story tonight, wherever in the world you happen to be watching from.